Hi there, this is Zura again, and I continue series of educational chess videos. In this video, I will talk about endgame fundamentals. Knowing endgame basics is absolute must for every player who is trying to go beyond the level of a beginner, pretty much. You may ask, why do I need to learn endgames if I do not know how to start the game? Well, let me tell you why. You need to understand the power of pieces, all right? And you cannot understand it when there are a lot of pieces on the board if you do not understand those pieces individually, okay? And this can be best learned by simple mates, how to use rooks, queen, bishops, and simple pawn endgames. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. For the material, I'll be using classic work Chess Fundamentals by third world champion Jose Raul Capablanca. This was one of the first books that I read myself. I was fortunate enough that it was translated on my native language. The reason I'm mentioning this is even though this was written about 100 years ago, these are fundamental rules and principles that were the same, are the same, and will be the same 100 years, 200 years going forward, considering that rules stay the same. All right, let's start with the rook. How to win with an extra rook versus lone king. Okay. First thing we need to understand, which is actually common in a lot of endgames, no matter we are rook up, queen up, two bishops, to corner the king. We need to corner the king. So the best way the rook can accomplish that would be going on the 7th rank, immediately cutting the king on the last rank, and then we will bring king closer. So for example, something like this. If king gets to our rook, obviously we will move that rook on the other side, and excuse me, once king basically will have to chase this rook. Let's say we can go king to d6 right now. If king goes to d8, then we have a checkmate here, and if king goes on the side, the other white king will follow all the way to the corner, and from h8 it will have nowhere to go, so rook to a8 would be a checkmate. It came out 11 moves here. I think with rook we should be able to checkmate the lone king pretty much from any position within 15 moves. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Well, you may ask, or you may have had the question in the previous position when king was on e8, what if king was in the center and it was not as easy to corner the king, right? In this example, let's see how king and rook pretty much from any position can still corner the king. We'll go to e3. If king goes to g file, then we will cut the king on the f file. If king goes back to e5, which probably makes most sense, then we'll go rook to h5 check. Now king will have to go back. Our king can follow through. King to e4 here. Again, if king goes now to e6, then we push them with one more horizontal, basically from 6th rank. The king will be pushed to the 7th rank here. If king goes on the side, we'll do the same thing pretty much all the way till the corner, and now when king goes to b6, we can push king towards the 7th rank. Okay, now let's start following the king again. Now king will probably black king if they are trying to make the life difficult for us. They will try to prolong the fight here. Now once king has gone to g7 to attack our rook, we can cut the king from f6. Let's say if king goes down, then we can corner it from here. If king goes on the side, we can go to g6, and this king will have only two squares, king to h7, king f7, and once king is in the corner, we can checkmate now from h5. All right, I'm gonna say within 15, maximum 20 moves, we should be able to checkmate the lone king. Okay, it came out 17. Probably it could have been done a little faster, but that is not a major thing we're trying to learn here. Let's look at the queen. Queen checkmate versus lone king is pretty easy usually, because now we can cut the king diagonally, and also from the like vertical as well as horizontal, right? Queen can do it all. So let's say we probably go to c6 on the first move. King will stay in the center, try not to basically go towards the corner, but let's say queen d6, king will have to go to g file. We will follow it through one more file here. King most likely will have to go either to h5 or h4 here, and we can go simply king f4, and king goes in the corner now. Queen has a couple of squares that can checkmate. Well, actually two squares from h6 and g4. Okay, 10 moves should be enough to checkmate the king pretty much from any starting position. Let's see two bishops. How do we checkmate with two bishops? Same thing. We need to corner the king. So we'll start, for example, with the king here. Now we can use the help of our bishops. There are probably, again, faster ways. There might be faster ways, but as far as we checkmate the king within the range of 25 to 30 moves, it should still be fine. Let's say king is cut on these two diagonals, so king will have to go to g file. We can go to e6, so king cannot return basically back towards the center. Now we are cutting the king from here and from here, so most likely king will go backwards here. Now our king comes in to take away these squares. Most likely king will have to go backwards here, and we can try to take away let's say h5 square as well. Right now king will go to h7. This is actually a little tricky. We need to be careful, always looking at where, when we make a move, where can the opponent king can go, right? So it can go to h8. So if we go to g5, now that would stalemate the king. So we don't want to do that. We want to get closer simply, so we can get closer with the king. Now this king can't run away the other side, so it will have to stay there in the corner. For example, we can check right now. If king goes to h6, we can checkmate from c1. If king goes to h8, we checkmate from f7. King will most likely will have to go to g8 to prolong it a little bit. Fastest way possible, we need king on g6, I think. So bishop to where? Bishop to where? Let's say bishop to f5, for example. So we can do this quick. Then we can take away e8 square. Make sure king doesn't run that way. Now we place the king on g6, and once king tries to run the other way, check, check, and checkmate. Okay, 16 moves, and we still probably wasted a couple of moves there. It could have been done faster, but again, as far as we checkmate within 25-30 moves, this should still be fine. Well, actually, one thing I need to mention that is important to know, when there are no pawns on the board, we need to deliver the checkmate within 50 moves. This is called 50 move rule. If there is no checkmate on the board for 50 moves. Opponent can claim the draw, and it will be accepted. Okay, so that's what the 50 move rule is. No pawn moves and no captures has to happen within this. If opponent has only king, obviously there cannot be a capture, right? It is true actually for queen versus rook as well. I once had an occasion when I was already a very experienced player, almost 2300 FIDE rating, that I was not able to win queen versus rook for 50 moves. And my opponent claimed a draw. This was on a national championship, so pretty embarrassing, I would say. All right, so in all these three basic endgames, principles were the same. We need help of the king. Without support of our own king, these checkmates cannot happen. Principle number 2, I would say, was we need to force the opponent's king into the corner. All right, now let's move to real endgames. Okay, what I mean by that is pawn endgames. All right, pawn endings. So gain of a pawn is the smallest material advantage that can be obtained in a game, right? And more often than not, it is sufficient to win. How? Well, by promotion. We know that once pawn reaches the last rank, it can promote to any piece that we desire. Most of the time, that is the queen. Okay? In order to be able to queen the pawn, rule number 1 is we want to have our king in front of the pawn. First example that we're going to start here, opponent's king is right in front of our pawn, so we are not able to win this. This would be a draw. How? King stays right in front of the pawn, the opponent's king, let's say, and the side that has an extra pawn will not be able to push the king in front of the pawn. Okay, so for example, it will go all the way to the last rank this way. Okay, king will now have to go to d8. This is a very important point. Okay, if it went to c8, you may see what could have happened. Now kings will stand in front of each other, which will force a stalemate. There is no progress to be made. So what I mean by here is if king went to c8, for example, this could be a little trick, especially in blitz games. This happens quite a bit at under 1000 levels, I would say. I'm gonna say that this entire procedure, how it works out, is very important to your general endgame knowledge. So I would highly encourage you to stop the video, take your time, play it out on the boards, play it out on different files, play it out on different ranks, and see how it works. I cannot emphasize the importance of these positions enough. It is absolutely must. All right. Now let's go to the position when king is in front of the pawn. Right. So now obviously we do not want to push the pawn to get to the same file as the king, because we just said literally that we want king to be in front of the pawn. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna push the pawn with one move. Okay. d4 would be a mistake. d3 would be a strong move. Now king will try to stay in front of the pawn, but we do not push the pawn. We bring king in front of it. This is the classic case of opposition, but we will talk about the opposition separately in a couple of minutes. Now let's see, king will need to basically go one way or the other, and then we will go on the opposite direction. Okay, king will have to stay in front of the pawn. Now we can still do the same thing here, get in front of the king here, get into the opposition, and once king goes on one of the sides, we'll go to the opposite side again. Now, if king comes upwards, then we can start pushing the pawn. But if king goes back to the last rank, we can do it one last time here. King, let's say, goes to c8. Now we can push the pawn, and once king goes one of the ways, we will again go to the opposite direction, and now king supports the pawn all the way to promotion. So we will promote to a new queen. Okay, another important detail to understand is corner pawns do not win, even if king is ahead of the pawn. Defensive side just simply needs to stay in the corner there, and we will not be able to force it out, and it will end up in a stalemate. All right, now that we know how to promote a pawn, let's see some examples of two pawns versus one when we need to create a passer. Okay, create a passing pawn is also a very important element of endgames. And what is going on in this position? I highly encourage you to stop the video and try to figure it out yourself before we move forward. If you're a beginner and you see the pawn endgames for the first time, then I encourage you to just follow through. So what's going on here? Let's see what happens if we push the pawn. Pushing the pawn right now might be very tricky, because you may think that, okay, opponent just takes it back, then we take it, and king will have to move on the side, then we can push the pawn, and king will be forced to move away, and then we can support our pawn to promotion, right? Yes, that does sound good, but there is a little trick here. On f6, the black king can move on the side without capturing the f6 pawn. That is probably the biggest difference between checkers and chess, right? Neither side is required to capture, okay? So on king g8 now, if we push king, let's say e7, one, well, actually only one. If they go king f8, king h8, we can go king f7 right now, forcing taking on f6, and then we promote with the checkmate, right? But what's gonna happen on king e7 is now they're gonna take on f6, and when we capture it back with the king, king will go to f8, and now kings are facing each other, so this cannot be won anymore. Now it's gonna end up in a stalemate. Pawn endings require a very meticulous calculation. You never want to rush pawn endgames. You want to take your time. Okay, so f6 doesn't win here. That leaves us with what? With the king, right? So now we will need to use our king here to push the opponent's king in the corner. Then we can again push them to h8, get closer with the king. King will go to h8, and now what do we do? Gotta be very careful not to play king f7 or king f8 and checkmate the king. So f6, if pawn captures it back, now actually king f6 also wins this, but king f7 is way simpler, and then we promote with the checkmate here. All right, let's see another example of 2 versus 1, where white needs to create a passer. First most natural move, f5. Here is a serious inaccuracy, and that's another reason why we need to be extra careful in pawn endgames. Now g6 would draw immediately, because if white pawn takes it, king will get closer, and once black king captures the pawn, it will be located right in front of our pawn, and we have already established that to be drawn. On f5, g6, if pawn pushes forward with f6, then g5 will basically cut through the defenses of these two pawns. G4 will not be able to support the f6 anymore, and then black king will simply capture it. So that is again a draw. So what do? We start with the king. King goes to e4. If king doesn't go to e6 in front of our king, then we again establish that bringing the king in front of the pawn is always a good idea. So let's go with king e6, f5 check, king goes to f6, king f4. Now if king goes backwards, then we can bring our king ahead of the pawn, which is again a good thing. If g6, which is probably the trickiest try from the black side, we would have to go g5 check, king moves backwards, and then f6. Let's see if king stays down to f8 here. We would go to e5, king f7, let's say king d6, king stays to f8. Now, how do we promote the pawn? We cannot promote the pawn immediately, this f pawn, because let's say when we go to king e6, black king will stay to e8. Now if we go f7 check, there will be king f8, and king f6 is a stalemate. Right, so we need an additional trick here. After king f8, the trick is giving up this pawn on f7, and once king captures it, then we get the opposition, king d7. King will be now forced into the corner, but eventually we will take the g6 pawn, which will result in promoting our pawn. Let's mention this rule also. If king reaches the 6th rank ahead of its own pawn, the game is winning. Okay, let me repeat that. King has to reach the 6th rank before the pawn does. Okay, let's see now similar positions, but 3 versus 2. Let's add one more pawn onto the board. The good rule is still try to create a passer, and to start with, probably we can start with any pawns here, but the good general rule is to start pushing the pawn that has no opposing pawn in front of it, right? So in this case, that would be f5 pawn. King would probably have to go back, then we can go to e5, king f7, we can push now g pawn, king e7, black has not much to do but to wait there, h5, and now if g6 is played, we can take, push f6, and we are into the same position that we just saw. Now we push f7, king will go to d7, and again by the help of shouldering the king and the opposition, which we're gonna learn in a little bit, we can promote a pawn. Okay, let's see some more 3 versus 2, but in this case we have pawns on 2 sides of the board, not only on one side of the board. All right. Again, it is generally advisable to advance the pawn that is free from opposition. So we want to start with g4. Opponent probably pushes something like that. Then we go with a4 now to blockade that pawn there. King f6, and now we can start working on our passer. Let's say h4, king e6, we probably go g5, king goes backwards, we'll probably bring king closer, then we'll push our corner pawn, king goes on the f7, and I think at this point we are ready to run on the other side. Basically, we are ready to create a passer here if king gets closer to our pawns, and before king does get closer to our pawns, we'll already be far away. Let's see how that plays out. For example, we're gonna get to a pawn way faster here with g6. We'll give that pawn up, and now the a pawn will decide the game. Okay, next up here, Capablanca talks about a very instructive example that he calls a cardinal principle. Now, what is this principle? Let's see it based on this position. By correct play, this position should end up in a draw. As mentioned in the previous examples, we want to start pushing the pawn that has no opposition on the file, right? So b4, then probably a4. King will try to get closer to that pawn to stop, and meanwhile this king will try to get to black pawns. Since the material is equal, it should be drawn. However, let's assume white does not know this principle and starts with a4, which is a mistake. But why is it a mistake, right? So this is the cardinal principle that Capablanca was talking about. a5, a strong move, and now a unit holds 2. Let me repeat that. 1 unit holds 2. In this case, a5 pawn will hold both a4 and b2 pawn, and it turns out pretty much that black is now pawn up on the king side. So the game will most likely continue king g2, king f4, and b4. Now b4 is the best try for white, because if king f2, this position will be hopeless for white now. Either g5 or probably king e4 first. The simpler way to win then would be bringing the king to c4 and then pushing this g5 pawn, since white will not be able to create a passer here regarding b4. And once this pawn gets to g4, h4, king will have to run on the king side, and meanwhile black king will take both of these pawns and then promote the a pawn. So for those reasons, b4 was the best try here. Black takes it. Now both pawns run to the queen, and we have a resulting queen's endgame on the board. We're not going to talk a lot about the queen's endgame, but one thing maybe that we can mention is queen's endgames are a lot of times drawn because of checks, because of these perpetual checks. That is very hard to avoid. So the winning side here wants to simplify the position, especially considering that we're going to transpose into a pawn endgame, 2 versus 1 with an extra pawn for black. So king will take on e4. Now, what should be the second part of the strategy? Second part of the strategy here is to get king in front of h pawn and then start pushing the pawns. This is a very important moment here. After h4, king goes to h1, and now how does black win this? Black obviously wants to create a passer here, but we want to be very careful and calculate accurately the sequence of moves. Let's say now if we go g5 immediately, turns out to be a win, but it would be a different scenario if king was on g1. For example, here we can win by g5 immediately because king, and when our pawn gets to g4, king lands on h1, and then we can go g3, and pawn now promotes to a queen. However, let's see the example here. If instead of king on h1, king was located on g1, now g5 would be a big mistake because king h1, g4, king g1, and when g3, either h takes g3 or king h1, both moves draw, because this would be a stalemate. H takes g3, h takes g3, king h1. Again, there is no progress to be made here from the offensive side. So we want to be very careful which square is king located. Now, since king was on g1 and we've calculated this, we play g6, and the rest is basically what happened in the previous example here. We push pawn all the way. King g1 now does not work the same way as it would work on the other example, because now g2 is forcing king to move away from the first rank. If h takes g3, then h takes g3, king g1, g2 also promotes and wins. Let's see the classic example next. How to obtain a passer. In a lot of books, you may see this called a breakthrough also. How does white win this? I highly encourage you again to pause the video and figure it out yourself. If you actually did that, congratulations, you are serious about your chess improvement. Now let's get back to this. White pushes b6. Now this only works on the 5th rank, okay, when the pawns are on the 5th rank. Black, one of the pawns will have to capture it, and now we want to create a passer that has no opposition in front of it, right? So if we want to push this pawn, we need to get rid of b7 pawn, of its defender of a6 square, correct? So we go c6, get rid of that defender, and now once that b7 pawn is out of the way, this pawn can promote calmly. The same thing would happen if the c pawn would take our b6 pawn. Again, b7 pawn is the defender of now c6 square, so we will get rid of it by a6 and then push forward to promote. The reason why this only works on the 5th rank and it wouldn't work on the 4th rank would be after the breakthrough, black pawns would be close enough to run their pawns themselves, so we would promote at the same time. So that wouldn't be a win, that would be a draw. All right, now it is finally time to talk about the opposition. Opposition is a very important part of endgame play in general, not only pawn endgames, but all kinds of endgames. So understanding it will benefit you great deal. Okay, let's start with this position. And I'm gonna reiterate this point, but key to understand is that player that moves last has the opposition. What do I mean by that? So what do I mean by that is if it was white to move here, the position would be drawn. If it was black to move, white would actually be able to win that. Now, let's see how this could potentially play out and why it is a draw. So the opposition means that their kings are standing in front of each other and there is only one square in between them. Well, technically not only one, it's supposed to be odd number of square because there are more than one type of opposition. There is diagonal opposition, there is a lateral opposition, and there is a normal opposition when kings are in front of each other. Also, there are one square in between, there could be two squares, and sometimes I've seen even like 5 square opposition. However, let's keep it to the most simple ones. And in this position, if white king went to d4, black king basically would simply follow it. Do not mind the voices, there is a tornado warning in my area, so that's what the sounds are about. So this king will basically simply follow the white king, and white king will not be able to make progress here. Now, in order to better understand the opposition, let's see the same position, but if it was black to move. So if here it was black to move, and let's say black played king d6, we would play king d4. Now if king went to towards the pawn, then we could go the other direction, and that way we have invaded the opponent's camp, and now we'll get closer to this pawn simply. For example, something like that, and we'll win the b5 pawn. If after king d4, king goes on the other side, then we are way closer to the pawn, and when this king starts to go for our h pawn, we are much closer to capture this pawn and then run it to the queen. From b8, this queen controls the h2 square, so pawn cannot even get there. Cool. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is bishop versus knight dynamics. Okay, we know that bishop and knight are around the same strength. However, there are some specifics we need to know in order to understand in the particular position which one is better. Okay, when someone starts to play from early on, I think knights tend to be preferred because knight jumps over other pieces and it can go to both white and black squares, right? While if bishop starts on a black square, it will end up on a black square. It will start on a white square, it will end up on a white square, right? However, it's a little more complicated than that. One thing in favor of bishop to be said is it can go from one side of the board to another within one move or maybe two moves, while knight will have to take a lot of time. Now, let's see it in the endgame situation. We have a position here where we have the pawns on one side only, and in addition to that, position has a closed character. Okay, it is very hard to imagine white creating any counterplay here. This c6 pawn is so far away from the white king, and meantime, if black can get the king to e4, which is not very difficult to imagine. I think it can immediately get to f5, and then it only needs to give a couple of checks to king to give up the e4 square. And if king lands on e4, then d4 pawn will become very problematic to defend. So, long story short, black may get chances here to win. Objectively, it should obviously be a draw because we have pawns on the same side. Now, to illustrate my point better here, I'm going to show you another example with the pawns on the same side. Now, this will be much easier for white to draw because there are no weaknesses and position does not have closed character. So there are no weaknesses into white's position, while in the previous position, the d4 pawn was a clear weakness. So objectively, this should also be very close to drawing. Now, let's see a situation when there are pawns on both sides, queen side and the king side. Now, position also has semi-open character. It's definitely not closed. It's not completely open, but it is also so it is somewhere in between, basically. When pawns on both sides, bishop is a little favorite because of what we mentioned earlier. Bishop can get from one side of the board to another very quick. So if there is a pawn race situation, if kings go on different sides, I think bishop here will have an advantage because simply it can control from, let's say, from g7, it can control the a1 square, while knight, in order to do the same thing, let's say, control the passing square here, a8, knight has only one square or two squares, right, b6 or c7 in order to be protecting that. All right, that's very hypothetical. Let's continue with this position. So objectively, this should end up in a draw, but probably white may get slightly, just tiny bit better chances. Now, moving on, the next we'll see, let's take a2 pawn from the board, a2 and h7. Now, what do you think? You're right. Now, this makes white's job here more attractive to do, in a sense that now creating a passer here will be easier for white since there is no opposing pawn on h5. Okay, so we'll probably try something like that. Well, obviously we'll need the help of king first. For black, it will be very difficult to do the same thing because we can simply place bishop from far away, where it will be controlling the passing squares here, dark squares here, a5 or a3. So now this the more pawns we take off from the board, I think now it's more difficult it will become for black. So let's see the next one. Now this position I think is already very likely to be winning for white. because they will probably simply place the bishop here and then start running this pawn, and bishop will be controlling a lot of things on the long diagonal, pretty much like half of the board. And with a little bit of help of a king, these pawns should start marching very fast. Again, for black, it will be hard to push these pawns. It will require not only the two pawns, but also help of the knight. It's not impossible to imagine black holding this position, but white has much better chances of winning. Next up, and I think the last position I'm gonna show is when there are 3 versus 3, but corner pawns on different sides here, right? H7 versus A7. From the previous examples, you may have an idea how this may play out. That is correct. White here has better chances because of the same reasons that we mentioned before. Can control things from far away, while knight will need to be very close here to protect that a pawn in order to help it promote. Okay, so king, I would think actually king probably will come to the center here, and depending where black king will decide to go, and most likely I would assume that is going to be toward h pawn, this king will then I would think that probably try to sweep the queen side here, and then the c pawn will become the passer. So the objective evaluation of this position would still be much better for white. Okay, again, I'm gonna say the same thing what I've been saying in this video throughout. I very much encourage you alone or with your friend or with your family members to sit down, put different pawns here, different pawn formations on different sides, and just simply try it out, bishop versus knight, how it plays out. And you will understand where knights can be used well, which is closed position and then one side fight, and where bishops can be preferred. And that is usually two side fights. All right, this concludes our review of Endgame Fundamentals. And if you are just getting started with chess, I highly encourage you to play through these positions, play against your friends, family members, or simply by yourself, setting up the board and trying to do your best from both sides. I think nailing these fundamentals to the instinct will take your game to the next level. I hope it helps. Cheers. I'll see you in the next one.